Right? Okay, so the next 4 or 5 weeks, I want to look at the life of David. And we're going to go through an era of his life. Now, you know who David is, King David? Israeli history? You got that? Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about him in a bit. But I want to look at this from a bit of a unique perspective. There are incidents in David's life where it's almost like as he has this incident unfold, there are questions that arise for him. And though he may not ask the exact question, the incident helps clarify something for him that he uses the rest of his life. And as I've been thinking through these incidents and the questions that those incidents raise, those aren't just 3,000-year-old questions. They're questions for today. They're things that we wonder about. They're questions that we debate and deliberate over. And so I want to look at kind of an incident each week and then what question that raises. So in a little bit, we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 16. It's an incident that we want to look at for today. And the question that comes out of it, for me, you might go, how did you get that out of it? Well, just hang there and there with me. The question that comes out of it is, when God sees you, what does he see? When God sees you, what does he see? I'll explain it this way. I was listening to something that Tim Keller was teaching on this last week. And in it, he tells a story about a woman who lives in New York City. And she writes for the New York Times Magazine. And she writes an article, and this is where he got it from, back in 1989. The story is that she's walking down a street in Manhattan, and she walks past this department store, and there's a giant showcase window, and she glances over at it, and rather than seeing what's behind the window, she sees her reflection in the window, and it stops her. And she doesn't like what she sees. And she kind of wonders how she became the person that she sees in the mirror. And she begins to ask the question, I wonder when people see me, what do they think about me? Who do they think I am? Which drives her to an even deeper question, which is this. When I look at myself, I wonder what my original best would be, because that's not the original best for sure. This is what she writes in the article. She says, more than 40 years of looking at myself in the mirror have left me, like so many women, and I would say not just women, men alike, but have left so many women almost totally ignorant of what they look like, me included. The mirror image I see is not a real reflection of who I am. I know that. But it feels real, and it is a composite of memories, wishes, half-truths, and old photographs. So she makes the decision that that's not who she wants to be, so she's going to have a major makeover. She buys a complete top-to-bottom makeover for herself, and after the process is done, she arrives home, and this is what she arrives home to. She says, at home, I am regarded as foreign, even frightening. My 7-year-old daughter screams at the sight of me and then cries for 20 minutes. Apparently, my metamorphosis has rendered me a beetle instead of a butterfly. And to her, I just don't look like Mummy anymore. And then she summarizes the article with this. The truth is, I don't know what I really look like anymore, or what I am intended to look like. So what does that have to do with David in 1 Samuel? Well, that's what we want to look at. And just in case you don't know, a little bit of background on David and where this fits in Hebrew history. The last couple of weeks we did a series on God Has a Name, and Moses and following the 400 years of enslavement, and now jump ahead another 400 years. The nation of Israel has found their homeland. They've solidified some territory in Israel. They're kind of have settled their own destiny and their own leadership structure. And at some point, they want to have a king, just like other nations around them. God says that's not the best idea. I want to be your king. They go, no, we want our own king. So it's like the humble God that we have. He's done this before in your life, right? Where you, God, I want that, wouldn't be best for you. I want that, wouldn't be best for you. I want that, okay. Then okay, you've got it. Well, this is what he does. And it doesn't turn out well. It doesn't. Their hashtag We Want a King campaign, they wish they had not ever done, because they end up with a guy who starts well. His name is Saul, and it goes very badly, really quickly. And it's a disaster for them. It's a disaster. And at some point, there's a particularly blatant disregard for God and what he wants in Saul's life. And God makes the decision that this is not going to go any further. He's going to find a new king. And so he sends Samuel, who's his representative on earth at that point, to Saul. And they have this discussion about how Saul's no longer living under the protection and the provision and the providence of God as king. He'll finish out the string, but he won't end up being king forever. He won't die as king. Well, that doesn't exactly go well with Samuel and Saul. They have this kind of falling out in their relationship, as you can guess, and Samuel goes off to his home to mourn what has happened. And then 1 Samuel 16 picks up, and that's where we pick it up. And this is what it says beginning in verse 1. It says, "Now the Lord said to Samuel, you have mourned long enough for Saul. I have rejected him as king of Israel, so fill your flask with olive oil and go to Bethlehem." In other words, go to Jerusalem, down to Jerusalem about 10 miles, and another 5 miles down to Bethlehem. Jerusalem, by the way, is where Saul was, and there's some threat to Samuel, we'll find out. "Find a man named Jesse," he says, "who lives there, for I have selected one of his sons to be my king." Literally, he says, I have found me a king, is what he says. But Samuel asked, how can I do that? If Saul hears about me, he will kill me. They're no longer BFFs, and so there's a problem. And yet this is what God says, go anyways. Take a heifer with you, Samuel, and say that you have come to make a sacrifice to the Lord, for that's what you've come for. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I'll show you which of his sons to anoint for me. So Samuel did as the Lord instructed. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town came trembling to meet him. "What's wrong?" they asked. "Do you come in peace?" Samuel would, from time to time, as an emissary of God, go from town to town maybe they were living astray from God, and he would correct them. And he had the power of God, and it was a rather frightful experience to have this guy come. And evidently that's what they're wondering, if that's what he's come for. To which Samuel says, "Yes, I have come in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Purify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." Then Samuel performed the purification rite. That would be confession and washing and a festival and anointing and sacrificing and that kind of thing for Jesse and his sons, and he invited them to the sacrifice as well. When they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, oh my goodness, this is the king. Surely this is the Lord's anointed. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse told his son Abinadab to step forward and walk in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, this is not the one the Lord has chosen. Next, Jesse summoned Shimei. But Samuel said, neither is this the one the Lord has chosen. In the same way, all 7 of Jesse's sons were presented to Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. Then Samuel asked, are these all the sons you have? That's all you've got? Well, there's still the youngest, Jesse replied, but he's out in the field watching the sheep and the goats. Well, send for him at once, Samuel said. We will not sit down to eat until he arrives. So Jesse sent for him. He was dark. He was handsome with beautiful eyes. And the Lord said, this is the one, because he looks so much like a king, right? Anoint him. So David stood there among his brothers. Samuel took the flask of olive oil he had brought and anointed David with the oil. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. Then Samuel returned to Ramah. So you may not see it in there, but David at some point in his life is going to ask the question, God, when you look at me, when you see me, what do you see? What do you look for? What are you looking for in me? We know that this is what the answer would have been to David. It's in the 7th verse of this chapter. It says, the Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. This is our tendency. People judge by outward appearance. Well, this is what the Lord looks for. The Lord looks at the heart. Here's what God knows about you and me, his finest creation. He knows that our default vantage point when it comes to evaluating others and ourselves, and we do this continually. We do this in all kinds of settings. We actually can't stop doing it. It's part of being made in God's image, actually. But our default is this, that we look at what we can see, what Yahweh calls outward appearances. We don't even get to verse 6 when the stud shows up, Eliab. He looks like a king, right? He's got the looks, he's got the size, he's got the biceps, reminds you of, well, not of me, for sure. We know that. But he looks like, why? Why would that be the conclusion? Because that's what we want in a king. We want someone that's powerful and we're safe with and is strong and mighty. It's kind of the William Wallace-ish qualities that we look for. Which, by the way, did you know this? That William Wallace was reputed to be 6 foot 6 inches tall. The average Scot of his day was 5 foot 6 inches. He was a foot taller than the average Scot. No wonder he was powerful and authoritative and people followed him, right? You feel safe with a guy like that. He can do all kinds of things. He's strong, right? Perfect for a leader. Well, another second, by the way, is that was the criteria that was used when Saul, the first king of Israel, was picked. That's the criteria if you look at it. He was that guy, that safe, strong, powerful guy. Didn't turn out well. Didn't turn out well at all. But this is what we look for. And while this is evidently how we evaluate one another, I believe, and sociologists would agree, that this may, in our culture, in our time, have risen to a new depth or height, however you want to think about it. We are more prone to select and cheer for people who of stature, of beauty, of good body shape, of wealth, of some fame, of some fortune. They appeal to us. And it's maybe never been more pronounced than in our culture today. Why would that be? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is technology. In the last 100 years or so, in-person, face-to-face conversation and exchange of ideas and debate and discussion of thought and positions and so on, and the written word have been replaced by images and pictures, displaced, I would say, in fact. I'll give you an example. Some of you remember 1858. There were some debates that took place between Abraham Lincoln and, it's your American history, Stephen Douglas, right? And it was the Senate race in Illinois. And if you had lived anywhere other than in Illinois, the way that you would have found out about those debates was in a newspaper, but it might be weeks later. There would be no pictures. It was all just narrative and text and opinion. That's all that you would get. That's it. And so when you went down to the local coffee shop to talk about these debates that Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas were having, you were talking about what? The issues, the ideas, the thoughts. Spring ahead today, 150 years later, a little better than that, pollsters over and over again tell us that when Americans pick their successful candidate, the person they want to have as their leader, what do they look for? This is not my opinion. This is what pollsters tell us. It's not issues, it's not platform, it's not argument. It is looks, it is charisma, it is how they carry themselves. It's all the external stuff. Why? Because that's how we get our information now, in pictures and images. And that has created in us a priority evaluation of people based on those external factors rather than internal ideas. There's a second thing, and that's a change and shift in worldview in the last 100 years or so. Again, sociologists will tell us that we are the first culture to ask what evil is, and more importantly, is there even such a thing as evil? Sociologists tell us that hasn't happened much before, if at all. The pattern of previous cultures has been that their moral conduct was directed by a set of moral values. Now, we may not agree with those moral values, but nonetheless, it was the guiding force for them in determining what was right and wrong, good and evil. The history of our culture has been guided by Christian Judeo values, using God's law and God's moral code. In the past 100 years, that has gradually been displaced by this guiding idea. Everyone gets to decide for themselves what's right and wrong as long as it doesn't hurt someone else. And that's what's been the guiding principle. There are no absolutes, and there's no baseline concern for what evil or what virtue is. Only, does it feel right, and has anybody been hurt by it? Just try talking to someone about their character or their values, and you are more likely than not to hear, "Stop judging me." However, our internal GPS is so strong in its desire to evaluate and determine who's safe, who's right, who's wrong, what's good, that we are now left with judging externals, and we are really good at it. And that's what we do. And yet, when we do that, it is devastating. It's devastating to women and men as it relates to sexuality, physicality. It's devastating to the mentally and emotionally unique among us, aging people, and so on. It's no trivial thing or passing matter that we look to external appearances when we evaluate each other, but it's what we do. It's not a slam on our culture. It's just what we've grown to do over the years. Now here's the thing. That is in direct contrast, we're told in this passage, to how God evaluates us. Directly opposed to it. Not just different, opposed to it. Because this text tells us that he looks at something much differently and different than what we do. It says that God looks at what? God looks at the heart. He looks at the heart. Well, if that's the case, what's the heart? I guess we better figure out what the heart is. Well, obviously, it's not the blood pump that's in your chest. He is not evaluating you to see if you have clogged arteries or failing valves. He knows. And he cares. Because you matter to him. And he cares about your health. He really does. But that's not what he's evaluating. He's not looking and evaluating the place where you feel emotion. We use the term heart so often in that, I love you with all my heart. You broke my heart. I mean it with all my heart. In those cases, typically we're saying that we have a deep emotion or passion for a person or a situation. That's not what this is about. It's not biblically what the heart is. The heart rather is this. Over and again, this is how the heart is referred to and thought of in Scripture. It is this. It is the center or inner core of our being from which all actions flow. It's the center or inner core of our being from which all actions flow. It's the will. It's the motivation center. It's the place of why I do what I do. It is the place that most clearly determines who we are and what we will become. No wonder God would be interested in that, right? Because it's how we live. It's who we become. It's who we really, truly are. And he's really interested in who we truly, truly, truly are. The function of the heart, the will, the why place, is this. It's to organize and orient life as a whole. It's what it does for us. And God is evaluating what is the organizing factor, what is the orientation of our lives. Matters to him above everything else in us. A healthy heart is organized and oriented around God. And the great disaster that God would see in human beings is that if we would ever organize ourselves, our lives around anything other than him, and orient ourselves to anybody other than him. And that's what he's looking for. He's not looking to condemn us. He's not looking to wreck us. He's not looking to poke us in the eyes and throw dust in our face. He is so concerned about what we organize ourselves around and what our orientation is. He says, I'm going right to the center of every human being, and I'm going to evaluate that part of them. Yeah, but look at their behavior. Yeah, we'll get to that. I'm looking at their heart right now. Yeah, but look at what they do. Look how they act. Yeah, no, I'm looking at their heart. That's what matters to me. 1,000 years after this story of David, Paul is going around the Middle East, and he's teaching about the resurrection of Jesus and Good Friday and the cross and what all that meant and the significance of that. And along the way, he's speaking initially primarily to Jewish people. And he says, here, I want to give you a little bit of Jewish history. And inevitably, as he does that, because he's on his way to talk about Jesus, he gets to David. But this is so interesting. When he gets to David, this is what he says about David in Acts 13:22. He does this a couple of places, but here's one. He says, but God, this is Paul speaking, but God removed Saul, remember we just talked about that, and replaced him with David, a man about whom God said, this is God on David, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. In other words, David's heart or his will is organized around me and oriented toward me all the time. He's an amazing guy. Like, I scoured the whole world. I found one guy who was worthy to be king. It's this young guy, David, but I saw the orientation of his heart and I saw what he was organized around, and that's my king right there. I want to work with a guy like that, someone who's perfectly aligned with me, someone who, when I say do this, he does that. Loyal, faithful, obedient, trusting. What a guy David was, right? Right? Do you know the rest of the story? I feel like Paul Harvey. Some of you are way too young to know what that is. But if you know anything about David, you know that isn't the real story. Or at least it's not the whole story. In real life, he didn't, in fact, do everything that God asked him to do. He didn't. In fact, he, in some ways, was a colossal failure. And he was an embarrassment as a man, as a king, as a father. Sure, he was David, the guy that fought Goliath. You know that story. I mean, the courage of that, right? Trusting God as a young kid to take on the enemy. Amazing. You read some of his Psalms of worship, you go, wow, like how you're able to express your love and devotion for God is just amazing. Your dream of building an environment where the whole nation of Israel could come and experience the presence of God, it's just amazing. David, you are something else. Your boldness, your courage, your faithfulness, your loyalty, like that is just really something. Your heart really is oriented toward God, isn't it? You've organized your whole world around him. It's just fantastic. And yet David is also the guy who had an extramarital affair with a married woman. In fact, it appears that he uses his power as a king to get her to sleep with him. Hashtag me too, right? And if that isn't like immoral enough and actually criminal, he has the woman's husband killed. That's right, man after God's own heart. Has the woman's husband killed to cover up the affair and the pregnancy that resulted from that affair. It's just tragic, isn't it? It's a tragic story. We hear stories of David's multiple wives, the struggle he had to be a consistent dad to some really troubled sons. As much as this poetry is about praising God and worshiping God, there are stories in his poems and songs, God, you've totally abandoned me. Like, what is this? There's deceit, there's lying, there's arrogance, there's self-aggrandizement. Like what? A man after God's own heart, right? It almost as if you wanted to, you could look at it this way. God, he is a man after your own heart, and let's not talk about that other stuff because that clearly can't be from a man after your own heart. Can't be. So let's just not talk about that. Let's just ignore that. But you can't. It's his life. It's all of his life. How can he possibly be said of him that he's a man after God's own heart when he's such a colossal winner and faithful, trusting, oriented around God kind of person and then can fail so terribly? Because that's what it means to be a man after God's own heart. You see, we look at what David did. We evaluate him based on what he did. The difficulties that he had, the decisions he made, and so on. What if God doesn't look at that primarily in your and my life? What if he weeds through all that stuff and says, we're going to get to that, but right now I'm going right to the heart. And he goes to David and he says, David, I see in your heart an orientation toward me. Yep, you jacked things up really badly. Like unbelievable what you've just done. But when I get through that, I see a heart where you long for me. I see your life light up when you worship me. I see this, David. You failed publicly, maybe more graphically than anybody else in this room. But you also confessed publicly with a tormented soul like few of us ever have. David, that's an orientation to me. Even when you fail badly, I see an orientation to me. I see you organizing your life around me. David, you're my kind of guy. You're a man after my own heart. Yes, God's perfect. Yes, he never failed. We do. So the question is, two questions. When God sees you, what does he see? He sees your heart. That's what he sees. And when he sees your heart, what does he see? Does he see a heart that's oriented toward him? Does he see a heart that's learning to organize itself around him? In spite of our failures, in spite of our wanderings, in spite of all of the struggles it is. The last 6 months, I've wandered. The fervency of my love for Jesus, I could talk about it more strongly than I could encounter and experience it. There's a lot of busyness. I could list a whole bunch of reasons why. There's just a bit of a wandering. I can see it. You might not have noticed it in me, but I can see it. The warmth of my time with Jesus in the morning just hasn't been as warm. I open up the scriptures, and I don't always get some revelatory dynamite out of it. Sometimes I read it half a dozen times and I close it and I go, I couldn't even concentrate. Anybody there? But I'm a man after God's own heart, like most of us are. Because I don't want to be that guy. I want to encounter him. Even when I don't, I want to encounter him. Even when I fail and I jack stuff up and I mess things up. I don't want to do that. I want so much for the vibrancy and life of his Spirit to stop me before I get there. But I know this, that I am a man after God's own heart. I want to experience the fullness of Jesus all the time. And for me, this is personal, this text today. Because in the last weeks, as I've been reading David's life and I've been thinking about it, I've been going, okay, I'm okay. I'm not a rock star right now. But I'm okay. Because my heart, Jesus, is inclined to you. It absolutely is. I want to learn more and more to orient my life around you. And I want to organize myself around what you want. Right? That makes sense? So we're all together on this. Now, Jesus, for your sake, I just got to tell you, thanks for telling stories like David's story. You don't candy coat it, and in the end, it's like this guy that kills giants and worships you in great ways and lives this exemplary life without a dint or a ding in it. And that inspires us too. But what transforms us is when we can relate to a guy like David who was that and he wasn't that. Because that's us, Jesus. You know that. Because you, even this morning, you just work your way through the junk, through the mess, and you look at our hearts. You know whether we're oriented toward you or not. You know that. You know whether we're organizing ourselves around you. Because we can't play games with you. And I was going to say we don't want to, but maybe we do. But even if we do, you go ahead and peel back the layers of our hearts. And you see who we are. You evaluate us as you would want to. You're good. You're faithful. We trust you. You go ahead and do with that as you wish, Jesus.